Welcome to our webinar today on an overview of AP automation features inside of Dynamics 365 Finance. My name is Dan Edwards and I'm a CPA and Managing Director with Crow LLP. I've been implementing and supporting ERP solutions for over the past 30 years. I've been working with Crow in our Microsoft Cloud Delivery Unit, specializing in D365 Finance for over the past 6 years. So let's go ahead and jump into our session today. Let's start by taking a look at our objectives. So the objectives of this session are to look at the new features that are available in Dynamics 365 Finance to help automate the accounts payable process. Some of these features have been with us for a few versions, and some of them are very new, including the most recent feature of the Invoice Capture Solution. In addition, we'll look at the additional automation and workflow available for applying payments, prepayments, matching product receipts, automating the posting, and we'll finish looking at some dashboards available to help analyze the results. As you can see, we have a lot to cover. So here's kind of a brief agenda. We won't spend a lot of our time or all of our time in slides. There are quite a few slides because I want to make sure you have something to follow along with. But we are going to see the software in action. So we're going to start at the beginning with what is AP automation. We'll dive into the Invoice Capture app, and that's where we'll spend most of our time looking at what is necessary to set that application up. We'll do a demonstration of that. And then once we have some invoices in D365, we'll look at the AP workflow and automation side. So let's start at the beginning before we get into any of this, and let's get a basic understanding of what do we mean by AP automation. So let's take a look at this slide, and this slide really gives us a vision of what AP automation could be. I'm sure many of you are aware the AP process can be very labor intensive. While there have been many attempts to improve this process through various tools like maybe EDI, many AP invoices still require somebody to sit there and read through them, manually enter them into the system. It may be also necessary to upload the files they received or even scan those files in and attach them to the records so that they'll be able to have a history, or maybe they're still putting them in a file cabinet. It's hard then for the approver to track all of this. So the vision is for a true vendor invoice automation is to reduce that manual intervention that's required. While it'd be great to eliminate all manual intervention, and the way they're talking about AI nowadays, maybe that's going to happen at some point, but that's still probably a pretty lofty goal. So we look at kind of the Pareto principle, 80-20. And if 80% of those invoices can be automated and be touchless, and we only have to touch 20% of them, we're going to be much more efficient. So the vision starts with capturing those invoices using things like AI, OCR, machine learning, moving that invoice in to D365, and then many of the steps you take in there, like applying prepayments, matching to the purchase order, sending it off for a workflow, automating as many of those as possible. So again, you're only having to deal with the exceptions. So now that we kind of have a vision and understand what we mean by AP automation or vendor invoice automation, let's start at the beginning. So most recently, Microsoft has introduced a new solution called the Invoice Capture app. So this is actually going to move us from what has been our vision into reality. So what is this Invoice Capture app? It is an out-of-the-box solution that Microsoft is delivering that will be able to listen to various channels for vendor invoices to come in. So whether that's Outlook, whether that's SharePoint, it's going to be listening, and then it's going to send them off into Microsoft's AI builder. So the artificial intelligence is going to read through that using machine learning, using OCR, using all the various components that they have there under the hood to read that data and then be able to bring that data directly into D365 Finance. Now, the one thing I want you to be aware of, don't look for this module sitting inside of your instance of D365 Finance. This is actually part of the Dataverse and what would be called a model-driven app. So it's actually going to be a different URL. It's going to be sitting outside of that. We'll talk a little bit about how that's accessed and how it's used as we get into the setup. It is going to be licensed along with D365 Finance. There's still some changes being made around all that, so we're not going to get into pricing or licensing details, so be sure to check with your partner or directly with Microsoft for that information as this module comes out. So what is the process that we'll be going through here in the Invoice Capture app? First, you're going to work with your suppliers, and probably many of them do this already, and have them email typically your invoices to you. So from your vendor, you'll be getting an email, probably a PDF in a lot of cases. It could be a JPEG or PNG file. There may be instances where they have a portal and you go download the invoice from them. Unfortunately, maybe somebody still mails them to you, so you'd have to scan that in. But you're going to have those invoices come into one of the channels where Power Automate, part of the Power Platform, is going to pick this up, detect that there's an attachment that it needs to look at, and ship that off to the forms processing model that's part of AI Builder, where it's going to then be able to look at that key information, extract that out of that document, even if there's lines and even if every invoice is not formatted exactly the same, bring those through. And then using RPA and Power Automate, it's going to be able to match that information up with the fields that are necessary inside of D365 and bring that into D365, where the automation could continue to move forward and move this into a matching process, an approval process, and eventually a posting process. So let's look at kind of the functionality around this module or this solution. And it's a new solution, so this functionality is continuing to change as this product's been in preview for many months and coming out here in general release. So there have been changes. So even from this webinar, by the time you get ready to implement it, there may be new functionality available. So first of all, we start with the different ways we can capture those invoices. So as I mentioned, most commonly would be through Outlook. So we can go through Microsoft Outlook 365, kind of an Exchange backend, which probably many of you are running today. Or you can also use Outlook.com and be listening on either one of those channels. Now, as I mentioned, maybe you have to download an invoice off a portal, or you have to bring an invoice in that you had to scan in. Well, you could actually save that file off to a SharePoint site or a OneDrive file folder that you've identified and bring those in and have those start the process. The files that it's looking for are PDF files, PNG, JPEG, TIFF files, anything along those lines is what it is able to read. Once it reads that, it's going to go through, do the processing. It will even double check to see if it's read that invoice before. So if you accidentally get the same invoice emailed a couple of times, you don't have to worry about it actually reading that a couple of times. It will actually stop that. Once the file's received and recognized, understands that yes, this is a file I need to process, it moves it into what we call a capture state. And this capture state is where it has started extracting the fields from the invoice and matching those fields up to the fields that are necessary to create an AP invoice in Dynamics. Depending on how you have things set up, if it passes all your rules, it will go straight in to become a vendor invoice or pending vendor invoice inside of D365 Finance. If it fails on some of the rules, it will move into invoice review, where then you are able to manage by exception and go in there and address the different exceptions that have come up on that invoice. So let's take a look before we get into actually seeing this application run live, let's just look at a few of the different screenshots. So when I first go into the Invoice Capture Solution, you'll see I'm open up to a dashboard. This dashboard is going to give me some analytics to let me know kind of what are the status of my different invoices, what vendors am I receiving invoices from, what invoices are being handled without exception, how have invoices come in over different date periods. So this kind of gives you a good overview of how things are running through the solution. Moving on from there, the next area I would go to is that received files. So this is going to keep a history of all those files that have been received in. You can see here in my screenshot, I have files that were emailed to me, Outlook to Dan Edwards, and then I have some that were dropped in a SharePoint site. So I can see all of those, and there's different filters that you can apply. So I'm looking right now at received files all, but you could have files that have not been recognized or anything that's been canceled. You can even write your own filters. So you might want to do a filter just looking at files that came in through email versus being uploaded through SharePoint or something like that. So now that I've seen all the files, let's move over to Capture. So Capture is the next step. When it's recognized and received that file in and understands that this is a file that we're going to want to put into Dynamics, it gets captured. So I can see here in my screenshot, I've got a couple invoices in the capture state. One of them has been captured. One of them is in review. I can see there's a couple of warnings on those invoices as well. So what this allows me to do is simply click on that invoice number, and I can drill down and see the detail that is come in with that invoice. So first thing you'll notice there's actually the invoice. So I can actually see what was emailed to us or dropped into SharePoint. So then I can start seeing how the AI tool has read that invoice. So the area in the upper right hand corner, messages, is kind of the critical area. So it's kind of giving me a confidence score issue here that it's not real confident about how it read this, so it wants me to look at it. Looks like we have a currency issue. So you'll see fields are labeled, so I can put this into an edit mode. I can make my changes as necessary. Once I'm done, I can complete the review and send this over to D365 from here. So that's kind of an overview of how the module works. So again, before I jump in and maybe run some invoices through it, let's step back into how do I get all of this set up. So the first thing you need to do is this needs to be installed separately. So as I mentioned, this isn't going to just show up in the next platform release or any of the next releases in D365. It is a separate app that will need to be installed by your Power Platform administrator. So it gets installed in the Power Platform. There is documentation on how to do that. I have the URL here on our slide. And as you notice, I'm currently working with the preview version, but this will give you the link to go through the installation. All the installation instructions are there as well. There's some dependencies on having Power Platform, having virtual entities, things like that set up. So we don't have time to go through and do a live install today. It doesn't take a lot of time if you have everything set up that is required in your environment. And again, I would recommend starting this in your sandbox, of course, before you roll that out into production. So once it's all installed, you're going to need to get the URL, the web address for this application, because that's where you're going to launch it. Similar to the URL you need to go into D365 Finance, you'll have a separate URL here to go into Invoice Capture. And the first thing you'll see is there is a Getting Started page. So this Getting Started page is really going to walk you through starting to configure this solution. So it's already got the connection to D365 Finance. That's part of the installation. So you don't have to tie it to the environment or anything like that. What you're going to have to do is really just set up how is it going to operate. So the first thing you're going to do is start by doing the channels. So how am I going to receive invoices? You might simply have one channel. Everything comes in. It's emailed to ap@mycompany.com or something like that. Or it could be every email to Dan Edwards. It could be everything gets dropped into OneDrive. Or as you can see in my screenshot, I have multiple channels set up. So I have the solution listening to my OneDrive, I have it listening to SharePoint, I have it listening to my email. So you can see there on the table the different channels that are available. So once you go in to create that channel, which you can do right there from the Getting Started page, you'll see that you have the option to manage the flow. I recommend you use the manage flows. It's a little easier and less technical to set up. I didn't get deep into my background, but I'm a CPA and an accountant. I am not an IT person, and I was able to do the install and manage all these flows without requesting a programmer or anybody to help me. So when you set that manage flow to yes, that uses the flow templates that come with the system. So again, those templates could be around Outlook.com, Outlook 365, SharePoint, OneDrive, so on. What's nice is you can click on edit there, and that will actually take you into Power Apps, into that flow. So like in my case, I wanted to set my flow up to actually look at email to the AP department versus email directly to me. So I was able to just change the connection for this flow. So now it's looking to email at the AP department. So again, you can set up as many of those channels. They're pretty straightforward to set up. Another thing you can set up, and this area is completely optional, is the file filters. So what this does is allow you to set up what the different sizes of those files could be, what file types you accept, and you can even put in some requirements around the file name. Maybe you tell all the vendors that it must start with invoice. So you could put that in the file folder. That way, if you got any emails that have an attachment but don't have invoice at the beginning, they won't see that. It won't attempt to try and read that invoice. So when I was doing my initial testing, I had no file filters on, was using my own email address, and then other attachments were coming into the system, and it was trying to work with those. So again, I would go with an AP specific email, but you could also do file filters to limit that. One of the key areas you're going to want to set up after you've got the invoices coming in are the configuration groups. So there are different types of invoices the system will work with. It can take a PO invoice, a cost invoice, or an invoice that just looks at the header and not the line items. So you're able to configure those through the configuration group. Another thing that you'll probably need to play with as you're working with it is the review conditions and how much tolerance you have in reading through that. So if it gives you a score back lower than 50, maybe you don't want that invoice to go through even though all the fields are filled in. So that's kind of what you're setting there in the review conditions. And then over on the right-hand side are all the different fields. So you can see you can tag certain fields as mandatory. You can bring other fields in. You can remove fields that you don't want it to read into the invoice. So you have control on that. And across the top there, you'll see the PO invoice, the header only, the cost invoice. You can set those fields different on those different types of invoices. So what is a cost invoice? A cost invoice would be something not tied to a purchase order. So that would not have a PO number on it. It may be like the electric bill, a lease payment, anything like that that doesn't necessarily have a purchase order tied to it. And in those, you're going to work with the procurement categories or the expense types. So speaking of vendors and legal entities and things, there is some required data in the system. So when you install, it uses the virtual entities to connect to D365. So it will bring in your different legal entities, and it can also bring in your different vendor accounts. So you can actually sync what vendor accounts you want to come over. Maybe you're only deploying this for one legal entity. You could limit the vendor accounts that come in to just one legal entity. And then the last thing that we're going to work with in setup is mapping rules. So when those invoices come in from your vendors, how do they know how to get applied into D365? So, AI is pretty smart, but how does it know that invoice is to USMF or whatever your legal entity might be? So you can actually set up mapping rules to help it learn legal entities, vendor accounts, items, and expense types. So what do I mean by a mapping rule? Here's an example of a mapping rule for the legal entity. So I have multiple legal entities. So when an invoice comes in, if it has Contoso Entertainment in the company name, so that's the bill to name that the vendor's sending the invoice to, and the address for that company has Coffee Street in it, that means it's my USMF legal entity. So it's going to look, AI is going to look for those two fields, and if it sees that, it knows to assign this to the USMF. So you'll do the same thing with vendor rules. If the invoice has vendor name of Ace Travel, assign it to vendor US 100. So, because a vendor typically doesn't put their vendor number on an invoice. So that's what you would do with the different mapping rules. So with all of that, that's a lot. We've been going here for a little bit of time, a lot of slides. So let's go ahead and switch out of slides here, and let's go see this invoice capture application work in real life. Okay, you'll see I've switched over to Dynamics 365. So let's take a look at how we can get started with the invoice capture application. So first of all, here in D365, you'll see there's no workspace called invoice capture. There's also nothing listed here in AP or any of the modules for invoice capture. Because again, if you remember, it is going to be a separate tab in my browser here. So this is actually the invoice capture application. It's a solution running on Dataverse in the Power Apps. But before we look at that, let me just go show you here real quick in pending AP invoices. I do not have any invoices here in this company. And if I look out here in PO received, not invoiced, you'll see I do have a couple of purchase orders that are waiting for invoices to come in. So let's go over here and take a look at the invoice capture application. So as I mentioned in the slides, we start with a dashboard. So this dashboard has different views in it. You can see I can look at the last 30, 60, or 90 days. This is customizable. You can make changes to any of these analytics, change the dashboard. But this really gives me a view of how the invoice capture app is running, count on invoices by vendor, looking at my different volume by week, things like that. And then the next two options on the menu actually look at our captured or our received invoices. But before that, I'm going to come down here to the very bottom and go into the system setup. So let's talk a little bit about the system setup and how it works before we actually get in here and use the app. So as I mentioned, you would install this. You'd have your Power App Administrator install this. They would link it to your D365 instance you'll be working with. And then once they give you this address, this URL, you'd be able to come in here, and then I can walk through this getting started page and get everything configured. So this is where we configure those channels for receiving the invoices. So if I come in here to configure, you'll see I have multiple channels set up in my instance. So I get an email coming to the AP team. I can have emails dropped into OneDrive. I can have emails dropped into SharePoint. The default channel I've turned off. I'm not using that. I wanted to control the 3 channels I'm working with. So I have those channels set up. I don't have anything set up in file filters. I let any files that go to any of those channels come through. Configuration groups, if we go ahead and take a look at the configuration group, this is where I am able to set up my details around review conditions. So how do I want to handle invoices? Do everything need reviewed? So that would be set to always. I can only force reviews on errors or warnings, or only force review if I get an error. So in my example, if an invoice is read all the way through and there's no errors, it's going to come out and go right through to D365. You can also set confidence scoring here. So this is letting me know that based on how well, what the confidence the AI tools had with reading the invoice, if it's 50% or higher, I give it an okay. Probably wouldn't do that low in a production environment, but I wanted to be able to push as much through as I can. I also then set up the 3 different types of invoices that we've talked about. So you can see here, do I get PO invoices, header only, or cost invoices? So you can see they give you a description here. So a cost invoice is not associated with a PO. Header only is just the header information. And then you define what fields you're going to be extracting and bringing in. And you can mark additional required fields, like I have the due date marked as a required field or a mandatory field. If there's other fields that you want to make visible, you can go ahead and select that by clicking on the managed visible fields. So I have my configuration group set up. I have my channels set up. I can have different legal entities set up. So if I go into manage legal entities, all this information came in for me automatically during the install through the virtual legal entities. But if I create new legal entities, I could sync those over. And then the last option was to bring in vendors. And same thing here, I can sync in vendors from all by a certain legal entity, or maybe I'm only working with certain vendors in this invoice capture. So I could bring over just those limited vendors. So once I've got the system set up, the last part is to set up my rules. So this is going to help the AI tool understand when it extracts data. So it extracts on an invoice that maybe it says it's billable to Contoso Entertainment, but what legal entity is that? So that's what the rules are set up for. So you can see I can come in here and I can define my rule when the company name contains Contoso and the address contains Coffee Street, put it to this legal entity, USMF in this case. I've got some other rules here set up for my vendors. So I think one of the invoices we may look at is coming from Land Packaging Group. So whenever the vendor name contains land, it goes to vendor US 119. And the reason we write this rule is because most vendors are not going to put their vendor number on an invoice. You need to have that vendor number to upload the invoice. So I could teach it this over time, but it's easier to shortcut it and build those rules. So I can build the rules around the vendors. I can even build rules around my items. So you may have items come in with different names or different item numbers from the customer or the vendor, and you can create those relationships here. Again, helping that AI build that knowledge so it will process faster. And then for the non-purchase order invoices, you can use the expense types, and this is working with the different what are called procurement categories inside of D365. So you can see when I have a rule for advertising, if there's an expense type of advertising on the invoice, that's the advertising type it will use. If it's electricity, then it goes to utilities. So I've built all those relationships. So with that being said, I'm going to go over and, not leave the Invoice Capture app, but I am going to go ahead and open up my email. So if I open up my email here, I just sent over an invoice. So if we look out here, looks like I just got an invoice. I've got it a couple times. I've done some testing, but I just got this invoice in from Land Packaging. So normally in this case, you would download this and start inputting it into the system. So I can see a preview of this file. So again, there's that land name. I can see the vendor number. I can see the description, all that. Well, I don't need any of this information. I'm going to just minimize Outlook because I'm going to go back over here to manage my invoices. And we're going to start here at the bottom with received files because sure enough, when that invoice came in, I can now see that it is in my pending files. So the system is currently processing this invoice. So it has received it in. It's recognized that that's a file I want it to read. And it's going to start processing that through the AI tools to try and extract all the fields. It takes it a moment to start reading all that through. If I come out here to captured invoices, we'll see I already have a couple invoices that were captured, and this new one from Land Packaging is currently in process right now. So I'm going to go ahead and let that process. We'll see what happens. And in the meantime, I have SharePoint and I have AP for my OneDrive. So I've got some other invoices out here. Let's see, here's the power company for June. Let's go ahead and drop that into OneDrive. And then I'm going to go over here to SharePoint, and I've got my advertising invoice for June, and I'm going to drop that into SharePoint and let those files upload. So hopefully if everything goes right, I'll come back here to my Invoice Capture app and be able to see that those are going through. So I just refresh my screen and I can see that the invoice from Land Packaging supplier has been captured, but it has one error. Let's go out here to received files and see. It takes a few moments. So it looks like the OneDrive for Business has come through and already been captured. So that is a good sign. So let's go back here to the captured, and well, that invoice was captured. I don't actually see it. So I'm going to change to go to all because I want to see why I don't see that. Well, that city power and light invoice, if you look at it, it already moved from captured to completed status. So if I come over here to D365, go to my pending AP invoices, you'll notice that city power and light invoice is already in the system. So the AI was able to read it perfectly, didn't have any issues, picked up that the electricity was actually the utilities procurement category, and it has put that into a pending vendor invoice for me. So you'll notice when an invoice comes over from Invoice Capture, it actually brings the document, attaches that as the primary document, and loads that information in. So we've already got one invoice in by just simply dropping it there into our OneDrive. Now I'm going to come back here to my capture or to my Invoice Capture app. I want to go back here to these captured invoices, and I'm going to take a look at this invoice from Land Packaging because there's a problem. It did not go through because it had an error. And you'll notice over here on the right-hand side, I get messages. So I see no item is assigned. So it had trouble reading the item number. So I can go ahead and say I want to start a review of this invoice, and I can come in here and simply enter the actual item number that it was unable to read. So I've gone ahead and done that. Now that invoice looks like it is okay. So I'm going to go ahead and complete that. And so you can see here I'm able to just manage by exception. One invoice went through with no problem. The other invoice, it had problems reading the item number. So I've read that item number. I reviewed it, and then just went ahead and transferred it. So you notice I received a message here saying this invoice has been successfully transferred. So if I jump back here to my pending invoices in D365, we'll refresh the screen, and sure enough, we refreshed the screen, and not only did we get land packaging supplies, but it looks like the advertising invoice also has come in the system. So if we drill down here on land packaging supplies, we'll see that the invoice is attached. I've got the right item number. It's gone all the way through the system. So what you were able to see there very quickly is, without much data entry, I think I had to put in an item number because it didn't read that item number, that the invoice capture module was able to bring all of this information in. I have complete history, so I can come out here and see all of my received files. So again, you can see here that the advertising came in from SharePoint, the electricity came in from OneDrive, the PO invoice was emailed to us. So I see all my received files. I have that history. It does check for duplications. So if they email me that invoice again, it is going to error out and not try and read it again. I can also look back at all my captured, so I can see all my invoices that have already been transferred over. So I get detail around that, my transfer dates, all of that information. So that's kind of an overview of what we can do with invoice capture and how we can automate all that. So now let me go ahead and transition back to slides, and we'll take a look at what happens to these invoices now that they're into D365. So all those invoices are now in D365, but we don't want to stop the automation with just the invoice capture. There's additional automation capabilities available now that we're in D365. Many of these features are built around D365 workflow. This workflow can be triggered when an invoice comes in through the invoice capture module or through any of the imports. And they've actually recently extended this so it can be triggered on manual entry as well. So it can start processing that through, matching product receipts, simulating the posting, moving it off to vendor or AP approval if you have AP approval needs, and move it all the way through to even doing automatic posting. So, our goal is that those emails we received in, or those files that we dropped into one of the channels, could actually go all the way through the system, maybe need an approval when they get in the system, but once they're approved, they'll go all the way through posting. So, as I mentioned, this is built a lot around AP workflow. So you do need to set up to turn on all the AP automation. You have to have at least one workflow. It's the vendor invoice workflow. So you can set that up under accounts payable setup, accounts payable workflows. There's different types of AP workflows. So you need to make sure it's the vendor invoice workflow that you're setting up. And I'll demo that to you here in just a few minutes. Once we have that workflow set up, then we can go into our parameters. And I didn't put the path to get to parameters, but that's accounts payable setup, and it's the first option there, accounts payable parameters. And so the first thing you would do is set up your invoice validation rules. This is especially important if you're using POs and you need to do your three-way matching, things like that. So you can put all your tolerances and things in this setup screen. And then the very last tab there on that payable screen is the vendor invoice automation. And we'll take a look at this screen in more detail, but this is where you turn it on to automatically start this process when invoices are put into the system, and then tell it to do the match automatically, apply prepayments automatically, and move through those different steps. So this is what really drives that automation. Now, where is this automation running? It's all running behind the scenes, and you can see that in process automations out under system administration setup. And big key to when you bring up that screen is make sure you click on background processes. And I've highlighted here, circled them there in red, 4 different processes that are running regarding AP automation. And that's the automated invoice workflow process, submitting the vendor invoice to workflow, validating invoice matching, and vendor invoice batch processing. So you'll see you can set up, once those are enabled, you can set up how often or how frequent they run. So some of them I run on an hourly basis, some of them I run every minute, every 10 minutes, anything like that. You can also set up a sleep period so these aren't running in the middle of the night when nobody's using Dynamics, for example. With those processes running, you can then see the history of what's going on in these invoices. So when these invoices were uploaded, they were immediately put into the automation path, and you'll see by looking at the workflow history what has taken place on that invoice. So if it's stuck, if there was a problem, you can see that on the workflow history. And then since there's so much automation, we need to understand how that automation works. So there is a new workspace called the Vendor Invoice Automation Workspace. And this gives you some key tiles to show you invoices that are in process, invoices that are assigned to you, things like that. And then there's a second tab on that workspace that has some Power BI built into it. So it shows you kind of the results of what's taking place with invoice automation. So, now that we kind of have an understanding, let's jump back over to Dynamics, see what's taken place with those invoices that came in from Invoice Capture and how all this automation is working. Okay, so we're back over into D365. I can see here, based on my workspace, I'm showing I still have 3 pending invoices. I'm going to come over here to the vendor invoice automation. And this is the workspace I was mentioning where I can come in and see what the status of invoices are, what's going on in the system. So I can see those 3 pending invoices I have. I will notice that of those pending invoices, 2 are now assigned to me and 1 was not submitted to workflow. So some of the automation has taken place. Something has happened on one of these invoices that looks like possibly holding it up. So let's talk a little bit more about this automation. So again, I want to go into some of the setups. So first of all, I'm going to come out here to the AP workflow. And this is the workflow I was talking about, the vendor invoice workflow. This is the one that you need to have turned on. So I'm going to go ahead and open up workflow here quickly for us to take a look at. For those that have not worked with any of the workflows in D365, it is a separate application that opens up. You don't have to load anything. It does it automatically when you select the workflow, and if I wanted to create new, anything like that, it would opened up there behind my browser. So let me bring it forward, and you'll see here it's kind of a graphical approach. So I have all the different workflow elements here on the left hand side. So I have automated tasks, so I can evaluate the invoices against our different policies that we have in place in the parameters. So that's kind of what I'm doing. I evaluate against those policies, and then I put a conditional step in here. So if the invoice is less than $500, jump right to another automated task of posting. If it's greater than $500, it's going to go into my approval path. So you can build in those conditions, you can put in different decision paths. So I could do a whole presentation on workflow and how you can build that out here in the workflow, but we don't have time for that on today's webinar. So I'll go ahead and close that. And then I'm just going to jump back to accounts payable. And you'll notice I'm getting some messages in the system. So we'll take a look at what Dynamics is telling me here in just a moment. But in that invoice validation, This is where you turn on that invoice validation and that you require approval on posting any discrepancies. This is where I set up my matching totals, and if I allow tolerances, I don't have any tolerances on the different charges and things set up. I do have three-way matching turned on with a 5% tolerance allowed versus a price tolerance. So as long as my invoice is within 5%, that's going to be considered a match. So I've got to set those validations up so I can do the automatic matching. And then vendor invoice automation. This is where I turn it on to start running those processes in the background. So the vendor invoice workflow, I can turn that on and automatically submit the workflow. I can make sure we're matched against a product receipt, have that matching take place automatically. So you can see here I have pretty much everything turned on so I can automate as much as possible. Now, where this is all being run is in those process automations. So I'm just going to go out here to System Setup, to Process Automations, and remember, go to the background processes. And those background processes, here I can see the automated invoice workflow, and I've got it running every minute. So that turns it on. Now you can come out here and view results, so I can see that it's succeeded in the past. There haven't been any issues with it. I can come out here to the Submit Vendor Invoices to Workflow, and again, I can view my results there. And I'll actually see, it looks like this is June 8th is when I'm recording this, according to my computer time. And this is when two were successfully submitted to workflow, and there was an error on one. So mentioned I had one invoice that wasn't in workflow. I can view the log and see, oh, it looks like that was a duplicate invoice number. So maybe it had got manually entered. The Invoice Capture app won't catch a manually entered duplicate invoice number, but fortunately Dynamics 365 will, depending on how you have the system configured. So then I can see that my invoice matching is running as well. So I can view my results on that. I can see 3 invoices matched again on today's date, and the invoice batch processing hasn't run yet because I haven't approved anything. So we're not ready to run that. So let's jump back. I've got some messages here, and it's warning me you've been assigned a couple work items. So I'm actually the approver of AP invoices, not very good internal control in my demo environment, but I do the invoice entry and the invoice approval. So I can see citywide advertising and city power and light are both ready for my approval. So it's showing up here on my work list, or I can come back in here to pending AP invoices, and I can see that both of those are sitting in workflow. If I go ahead and select workflow, I can go ahead and approve those. So I don't need to put in any message. I'm just going to go ahead and hit approve, and I'm going to go ahead and approve this one as well. And then we'll take a look. This land packaging did not go through to workflow. So again, I can view the automation history. So I can see that it did the product matching and that it then failed on being submitted to workflow. And we saw that when we were looking at process automation. And then I have the failed step. So I can see how all that's progressed. So you can see it there from the menu at the top, or actually if you drill down into the invoice, you may have noticed a new area here. So I can see the step fail as well. So this shows me the blue link shows me the view automation history, and then I can view the most recent results. So again, it's showing me that that invoice number already exists. So I'm going to need to go ahead and make a change with that invoice number if I wanted to continue that forward, so I can go ahead and save and submit this to workflow at this point manually. So again, allows us to only touch things that have issues with them, like this invoice did by the duplicate invoice number. So if I jump back out here, let me look at my pending invoices, and now I can see all three of them are in process for workflow. So these have been approved. So now that they've been approved, the next time that process runs for the automation and for the batch posting, those should actually post for me. So that's kind of nice to see how that moves through the system. So the last thing I want to talk about in the demo side is, I mentioned this captured invoices is a separate tab. And for some people that probably works well. I wasn't a real fan of that. So I looked for other ways that I could get to these captured invoices here. So what I'm going to do is actually grab that URL. So I'm just going to do a Control-C there, and I'm going to come out here to Teams. And you notice I've already done it here in my Teams, so I can see my invoice capture actually appearing here in my AP team. I can actually see my received files. And the way I've done that is simply just clicking on the plus sign here to add an additional tab in Teams. I'm adding a website tab. And so I'm just going to call this the webinar tab, and just go ahead and post that URL in. And the key to make it look good so you don't get the menu across the top and all of that that is additional is you need to add ampersand command bar. So CMD bar equals true, another ampersand sign, and nav bar equals off. So it's true and off. I'm not going to post about that channel. I'm just going to go ahead and hit save. And now you see those captured invoices are showing up, and that tab will stay in there. So I just wanted to point that out as a little tip in how you can possibly work with the captured invoices as well, the invoice capture app. And sure enough, you look at that, I just did a refresh on my pending vendor invoices, and they've all posted. So that purchase order invoice did not require a workflow because it was $499. I don't know if anybody caught that, but it did not require an approval because it was under $500. So you've seen I never had to hit the post button. All I really had to do with those two other invoices was approve them. So hopefully you saw that as we went through. So let's just move back over and wrap up our presentation. So let's just kind of summarize what we looked at today. What you saw is there's quite a few features here in D365 Finance to really help with your AP automation. That starts with the new Invoice Capture app that's using AI and OCR integration to automatically read and process those invoices. Those can be coming from multiple channels. We saw OneDrive, SharePoint, and Outlook all sending invoices in to the solution today. The system is going to learn based on your corrections and adjustments that you make as it progresses, so it will continually get better as it learns different invoice formats and layouts and sees that from different vendors. Once that moves into D365 Finance, the automation continues and really allowing you to only need to handle those exceptions. So as we saw, one of our invoices came in with a duplicate invoice number. We knew we wanted to accept that, so I was able to go ahead and make the adjustment to the invoice number and push that through. But my other invoices went straight to approval. Once they were approved, they went straight to posting. I didn't have to have any other involvement than that. So you can see how this really can increase your AP team's productivity, allowing them only to manage the exceptions versus managing every invoice. So with that, I'd just like to thank everybody for joining me today. Taking a look at the AP automation inside of D365 Finance. Please be sure to connect with me out here on LinkedIn. Try to post different things around D365 occasionally, and feel free to message me or anything if you have any questions. So again, thank you very much for joining today, and have a great day.